The dust had not yet settled on her husband's grave when the men of Cutter's Creek began circling like vultures waiting for the smell to clear. Lillian Wallace stood at the edge of the freshly turned earth, her black dress drinking in the merciless Arizona sun of 1882, her jaw set so tight it ached. She was 26 years old, the owner of 40 acres of dry but workable land, a small herd of cattle, and a reputation for being too proud for her own good. That last part had come from the mouths of men who did not like being told no, and she had long since stopped caring what they thought. But standing there with the dirt still damp and her hands folded in front of her, she felt the full weight of what being alone in this country truly meant. Her husband, Thomas Wallace, had been a decent man. Not a passionate one, not the sort who made her heart race or her thoughts scatter, but decent and steady and fair. He had died of a fever that swept through the valley in late September, taking 3 others with it before the cold air came and chased the sickness off. 6 years of marriage, and now a mound of earth and a wooden cross with his name carved in uneven letters by the hands of their neighbor, old Pete Garrity, who had done it as a kindness because Lillian could not bring herself to hold the chisel. She had a daughter, Clara, 5 years old, with Thomas's brown eyes and Lillian's stubborn mouth. Clara did not fully understand what death meant yet, only that Papa was not coming home, and she had asked 3 mornings in a row whether he had gone to the river. Lillian had told her yes, because the truth was too large and too sharp for a 5-year-old to hold, and because sometimes a mother needed to buy herself a little more time before she had to hand that kind of weight to her child. The trouble started the very next week. Harlan Briggs, who owned the land to the north and had been casting covetous eyes on the Wallace property for 2 years, rode up to her porch with his hat in his hand and an offer on his lips. He made it sound like charity. He offered to buy her out, saying she would not be able to manage on her own, that a woman alone was a risk to herself, and to the community that Clara needed stability. He said all of this with a soft voice and a harder pair of eyes, and Lillian told him to ride back the way he came. He did, but he looked over his shoulder twice before he disappeared around the Cottonwood Bend, and that backward glance told her everything she needed to know about his intentions. She hired 3 hands for the winter work. 2 of them quit by November, and the third, a young man named Cobb Whitley, stayed only because he was 17 and had nowhere better to be. He was a good worker, but he was not strong enough to manage the full weight of the ranch alone, and Lillian found herself rising before dawn every day, working beside him until the light failed, then sitting at the kitchen table after Clara was in bed, going over the ledger by lamplight until her eyes burned. It was in December, on a Tuesday that smelled like coming snow, that Edwin Brenner rode into Cutter's Creek. She did not see him arrive. She heard about him first from me Dunlap at the general store, who said a man had ridden in on a gray horse the color of storm clouds, had taken a room at the Hollowell Inn, and had asked about work. Me said he was tall. Me said he was quiet. Me said he had the kind of face that made a woman want to look twice, and the kind of eyes that made her wish she had not, because they saw too much. Lillian had listened to this and bought her flour and her salt pork and gone home without giving the stranger another thought. Edwin Brenner gave her cause to think about him 4 days later, when he showed up at her gate. He rode the gray horse me had described, and me had been right about the color. It was an unusual animal, pale in the body and dark at the mane and legs, the kind of horse that looked like it had been painted by someone who could not quite decide what they wanted. The man himself was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in a way that suggested he had spent most of his life doing hard physical work, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his coat and eyes that were a very particular shade of gray-green, like the color of sage after rain. He wore a battered hat with a crease down the left side, and his coat was thick wool, well-worn but clean. He stopped at the gate and did not open it. He waited. Lillian watched him from the porch for a long moment before she came down the steps. She was carrying a bucket and she did not set it down because she had learned that men took a woman putting down what she was holding as an invitation to stay. "Can I help you?" she said. I heard you might be needing a hand, he said. His voice was low and even, with a faint accent she could not immediately place, somewhere south of the Missouri border, she thought. I'm looking for work. My name is Edwin Brenner. I've worked cattle in Texas and New Mexico both, and I know a working ranch when I see one. What do you see here? She asked, because she wanted to know whether he would tell her the truth or try to flatter her. He looked at the fence line, which needed mending in 2 places. He looked at the water trough, which had a crack running along one side that she had been patching with tar and prayers. He looked at the barn, which was sound but whose door hung slightly off its upper hinge. I see a ranch that's been working hard and could use an extra pair of hands, he said. Not a failing operation, just one that's short on help. She studied him. You come with references. I do. He reached into his coat and produced a folded letter, which he held out over the gate without dismounting. She walked forward and took it, unfolded it, and read it standing there in the cold. It was from a rancher in New Mexico, a man named Aldous Crane, and it said that Edwin Brenner was a hard worker, an honest man, good with horses and cattle both, and that he was leaving of his own accord for reasons of his own that Crane did not elaborate on but did not hold against him. She folded the letter and handed it back. I can't pay much, she said. Room in the bunkhouse, meals, and what I can spare from the end-of-month money. It won't be much through winter. I'm not looking for much, he said. I'm looking for honest work. She considered him for another long moment. The wind came through and moved the bare branches of the cottonwood at the corner of the yard, and somewhere in the barn a cow lowed, low and patient. You can put your horse in the second stall, she said. Cobb Whitley will show you where things are. I expect an honest day's work from anyone on this property, and I don't tolerate drinking on the job or anything that makes my daughter uncomfortable. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am, he said, and he meant it simply, without edge or performance. She turned back toward the house, and he opened the gate himself, which she appreciated. Some men waited to be invited through every single door. Edwin Brenner settled into the rhythm of the Wallace Ranch the way water settles into a dry streambed, quietly and completely, filling the gaps that had been there without making a fuss about it. He fixed the fence line in the first week. He repaired the water trough with proper mortar that he mixed himself, not tar and prayers. He rehung the barn door so it swung true. He worked alongside Cobb Whitley without condescending to the boy, which Lillian noticed and filed away, because how a man treated people with less power than himself told her more about his character than anything he might say directly to her face. Clara met him on his 3rd day at the ranch. She came barreling out of the kitchen door at midday with a biscuit in each hand and stopped dead in the yard when she saw him filling the water trough. She stared at him with Thomas's serious brown eyes. "Who are you?" she demanded. He crouched down to her level, which put him at about her height, which was a thing she seemed to appreciate because her expression shifted from suspicious to merely cautious. "My name is Edwin," he said. "I work for your mama." "Are you good at cows?" she asked. "Fairly good," he said. "Papa was good at cows," she said. "I heard he was," Edwin said, and there was nothing false in it, nothing performative. He said it and let it sit, and Clara looked at him for another moment and then held out one of the biscuits, which he accepted with a gravity that matched the offering. Lillian had watched this from the kitchen window. She had pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and told herself that warmth she felt in her chest was just the stove at her back. The months turned. December gave way to January, and January brought the kind of cold that made the cattle miserable and the work twice as hard. There were nights when the temperature dropped so sharply that the water in the wash basin was solid by morning, and Lillian would wake before first light to start the stove and boil water for Clara's oatmeal, and then pull on her coat and her boots and go out to help with the morning feeding, because there was simply too much to do and not enough hands. She would find Edwin already there, already working, breath steaming in the cold air, moving with a calm efficiency that she found both useful and, increasingly, difficult to ignore. They talked. not at first in long exchanges, but in the small conversations that naturally arise between people working in close proximity. He told her he had grown up in Missouri, on a farm, the second of 4 brothers. She told him she had come from Virginia originally, that her father had been a school teacher, that she had read more books than most women in the territory, that she was not sorry about that. He did not seem to think she ought to be sorry about it, which was refreshing. He asked about Thomas once carefully, and she told him what was true, that Thomas had been a good man and that she had been fond of him, and that the loss of him had left a hole in the practical management of her life that she was doing her best to fill. She did not pretend to a great passion that had not existed, and Edwin listened without trying to fill her sentences or tell her how she ought to feel, which was something she had not received from most people since Thomas died. February brought Harlan Briggs back to her porch. He came on a Saturday morning, this time with a different kind of offer. He had not brought his hat in his hand this time. He stood straight, and his voice had lost its charitable tone. He told her he had spoken to the bank in Flagstaff, that Thomas had taken out a loan before he died, and that the bank was going to want payment by spring, and that she might find it difficult to come up with the sum without selling some portion of the land. He said he would be willing to purchase the eastern 40 acres, which would solve her problem and free her from the burden of managing so much on her own. Lillian stood in the doorway with Clara behind her and kept her voice completely level. "I know about the loan," she said, which was true. "I have a plan to meet it, which is my own business. Thank you for your concern." Briggs's eyes went to Edwin, who had come around the corner of the barn at some point during the conversation and was now standing in the yard, not approaching, not threatening, just present. Something shifted in Briggs's expression. "You hiring strangers now?" Briggs said. "I'm hiring capable help," Lillian said. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs." Briggs left, but the look he sent Edwin as he went was not a friendly one. That evening, Lillian sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and worked the numbers again, as she had been working them every other evening for weeks. The loan was $240. She had cattle she could sell in the spring, and Edwin had suggested in passing, careful not to overstep, that if she brought the herd to Flagstaff rather than selling locally, she would get a better price because the rail traffic moved through there, and the buyers were more competitive. She had already been thinking the same thing but had not worked out the logistics of making the drive with such a small crew. She went to the bunkhouse door that night after Clara was asleep. She knocked. Edwin opened the door with his coat off, in his shirt and suspenders, a book in his hand, which surprised her enough that she forgot for a moment what she was going to say. "You read," she said. He looked at the book, which was a collection of essays she could not immediately identify, and then back at her. "My mother thought it was important," he said. "She was a schoolteacher's daughter, as it happens." Something in Lillian eased just slightly. "I wanted to talk to you about the cattle drive," she said, "if you're willing." He stepped back and gestured for her to come in. The bunkhouse was spare but tidy, which she had noted before in passing. He pulled the single chair out for her and sat himself on the edge of the cot, and they talked about the drive for an hour, the route, the timing, who they would take and who they would leave with the homestead, what price she could reasonably expect, how they would negotiate. He knew what he was talking about. He had done it before. He gave her his knowledge without taking anything from her, without trying to assume control of a decision that was hers to make. When they finished, he said, "It's your call, Mrs. Wallace. I'll make it work whichever way you decide." She stood to leave and turned back in the doorway. "What were you reading?" she asked. "Emerson," he said. "He has a thing or two to say about self-reliance that seems fitting." She smiled at that, briefly and unexpectedly, and the expression caught her off guard. She turned before he could see it fully and walked back to the house through the cold night air, and she stood at her own kitchen window for a moment looking out at the dark yard, and told herself firmly that nothing about this situation was simple, and she needed to keep her head clear and her heart where it belonged, which was fully and completely devoted to the task of holding her land together and raising her daughter. She was mostly successful at this for another 6 weeks. It was March when things began to shift in ways she could no longer attribute solely to the proximity of hard work and shared purpose. The cattle drive went well. They brought the herd to Flagstaff in 4 days, Edwin and Cobb and Lillian herself riding alongside, because she was not the kind of woman to send her herd out without her hands on the reins. The buyers in Flagstaff paid a fair price, and she came home with enough to pay the bank loan, and a small reserve besides. On the way back, riding through the high country where the juniper smelled like green and the sky was so blue it almost hurt, Edwin pulled his horse alongside hers and said nothing at all, just rode beside her, and the silence was so comfortable it was almost startling. "I did not thank you properly," she said after a while. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You did the work." "We did the work," she said. He looked at her then. He had a way of looking at her that she was beginning to recognize, a way that was direct and serious and also, underneath that, warm, like a fire that was not trying to burn anything, just existing with heat in it. "Yes," he said simply, "we did." She turned to look at the country ahead, the red rock and the juniper and the enormous endlessness of the Arizona sky, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, something that frightened her and called to her in equal measure, something that was not simple fondness but was not yet something she was willing to name. She kept it unnamed for a while longer. Spring came in hard and green. The calves dropped in April, and there were 10 healthy ones, which was good. Cobb turned 18 in April and received a modest birthday supper that Clara insisted on, complete with a lopsided cake that Lillian helped her bake, and that Edwin ate 2 pieces of while maintaining an expression of sincere appreciation that made Clara glow with pride. Lillian watched them at the table, her daughter and her ranch hand and the young man who had come to work for her, and felt the strange completeness of it, the way this particular configuration of people had taken on a shape she had not planned but that fit together surprisingly well. It was in May that Edwin told her about the reason he had left New Mexico. He had not offered it unsolicited. She had asked because enough weeks had passed that she felt she had the right to know, and because the letter from Crane had been too careful in its omission for her not to wonder. They were sitting on the porch after supper. The evenings had turned warm and the sky was a long, slow fade from orange to purple, and Clara was asleep inside, and Cobb was in the bunkhouse, and the night was still enough that she could hear the cattle moving softly in the near pasture. "There was a woman," Edwin said. Not evasively, but carefully, choosing the words the way a man does when he is not trying to make himself look good, only trying to be honest. "I had been working for Crane for 3 years. She was Crane's niece, came to visit from Santa Fe. We spent time together. I thought we were building toward something. She thought we were passing time." He paused. "She married a man from Santa Fe with a good business and a house with 2 floors. I don't blame her for it, but it was clear that staying on that ranch was not going to be good for anyone, including me." Lillian looked at her hands folded in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was too for a while," he said. "Less so now." And he said this simply, without any pointed implication that she was the reason for the reduction in his sorrow, which she appreciated, because she was not ready for that particular implication to exist between them yet. But she noticed it anyway. "Edwin," she said. "Mrs. Wallace," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking out at the darkening pasture, his profile clear against the last of the evening light. He was a genuinely good-looking man. She had long since admitted that to herself privately, but that was the least of it. The rest of it was the way he was. The way he treated Clara like she was a person worth talking to. The way he never made Lillian feel like her land or her decisions were things that needed to be managed by someone else. The way he had filled in the gaps of the ranch without trying to take it over. The way he could be quiet in a way that felt like company. "I like having you here," she said. "I want to be honest about that." He turned to look at her then. "But I am not ready," she said. "For whatever you might be thinking about when you look at me the way you do, I am not ready for that. Thomas has not been gone a year. Clara is still young enough that everything feels fragile." And I have spent so much of my life having things happen to me, decisions made around me, circumstances I did not choose, and I need to be the one who decides this when I decide it if I decide it. Do you understand?" He was quiet for a long moment, not hurt, not defensive, just considering the way he considered everything. "I understand," he said. "I don't want you to leave," she said, because that needed to be said too. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. He said it plainly, without drama, without the weight of a promise being extracted. He said it the way he would have said that the fence was mended or that the calves were healthy, as a simple fact about the state of things. "I will be here when you are ready, Lillian, and if that day doesn't come, I'll still be here because this is a good place and you are a good woman to work for, and I'd rather be honest with you than comfortable somewhere else." She looked at him for a moment. "You called me Lillian," she said. "You said your name was Lillian," he said. "I can go back to Mrs. Wallace if you prefer." "No," she said after a beat. "You can call me Lillian." She went inside and she did not sleep for a long time, lying in the bed she had shared with Thomas and looking at the ceiling and turning the evening over in her mind, not with regret but with a kind of quiet wonder at the fact that she had said what she meant, completely and truly, and he had heard it and answered it honestly, and neither of them had been broken by the exchange. That was not a small thing. He was there the next morning, already in the barn when she came out, and he looked up from the feed he was measuring and said, "Morning, Lillian," and she said, "Good morning, Edwin," and they went about the work of the day, and it was comfortable and ordinary, and underneath that ordinariness something had settled between them like a foundation being laid. Summer came in hot, the way Arizona summers do, with a heat that sat on the land like a wool blanket and did not move until the late afternoon storms rolled in from the mountains and broke the air open with lightning and the smell of wet earth. There was a day in June when one of those storms came up so fast and so hard that they were still out in the south pasture when the first crack of thunder split the sky, and the cattle spooked and scattered, and Lillian's horse shied so suddenly that she nearly came off the saddle, and Edwin was there beside her in 2 heartbeats, not grabbing her arm condescendingly, not swooping in to rescue, just steady and close while she got her horse back under control, and then, when the animal had calmed, looking at her with that level look and saying, all right," she said, breathless and laughing a little, because the whole thing had happened so fast and was over so fast. They rode back through the rain together, and she was soaked through by the time she reached the porch, and he was soaked through by the time he reached the barn. And when she came inside and Clara looked up from her bread dough with wide eyes and said, "Mama, you're wet," Lillian laughed again, and it was a real laugh, full and genuine, and she realized with a small and private shock that she had been laughing more often this summer than she had in years. She did not tell Edwin this, but she thought he probably knew. Cobb Whitley had been courting a girl in town, a seamstress's daughter named Violet Hargrove, with a transparency that was both charming and slightly inconvenient, because it meant his attention wandered in the late afternoons when he ought to have been mending tack. Edwin covered for him with a patience that Lillian pretended not to notice, and did notice very much. She found herself one evening telling Edwin, over supper on the porch, that she had once been young enough to lose track of herself over another person, and that she wondered sometimes if she had used up that capacity. He said, "I don't think that's how it works. I think it just waits." She looked at him. "How old are you to be so certain about that?" 30, he said, "and not certain about much, but certain about that." She looked down at her plate. "I've been thinking about Thomas a lot lately," she said. "Not with grief exactly, more like with gratitude. He gave me this land and he gave me Clara and he treated me fairly, and I think I should honor that properly before I do anything else." Edwin nodded. "That's a right way to think about it," he said. "You're very patient," she said, and there was something in her voice that was part observation and part apology, and part something else she did not name. "You're worth being patient for," he said, and then he picked up his fork and changed the subject to whether they ought to look at acquiring another bull before fall, and she was simultaneously grateful and exasperated by his ease. She talked to me Dunlap about it one afternoon in July, sitting in the back of the general store while Clara looked at the ribbon display with the focused intensity of a 5-year-old. Me was a practical woman who had been married twice and widowed once and had no patience for romantic nonsense but a great deal of sympathy for genuine feeling. "Do you want to be with him?" Me asked. "I don't know," Lillian said. "I think I do." But wanting something and being ready for it are two different things. They are, me said, but they also don't have to stay two different things forever. What if I get it wrong again? Lillian said. Not that Thomas was wrong, but what if I choose wrong in a different way, choose someone who is kind and patient and present, and then turns out to be something else entirely once he has a reason to stop trying? Me looked at her with the direct gaze of a woman who had no time for vague fears but could hear the specific one underneath them. "You're not asking about men in general," she said. "You're asking about Edwin Brenner." Lillian was quiet. "What I've seen," me said carefully. "A man who comes to a widow woman's ranch, works hard for modest pay, treats her daughter like a small person and not a nuisance, covers for the kid he works alongside when that kid has starry eyes for a girl in town, and who has not once, as far as I can tell, pushed a woman who told him she was not ready. That is not a man who is performing goodness for an audience. That is a man who is just good." Lillian turned her wedding band on her finger. She had been wearing it still because she was not sure what it meant to take it off and she was not ready to find out. "I know," she said. "That is exactly what frightens me." Me gave her a long look and then smiled, a small private smile of a woman who has lived long enough to find certain kinds of fear funny in the gentlest way. "Oh, honey," she said, "you're going to be fine." It was August when Harlan Briggs came back, and this time he did not come alone. He brought a man from Flagstaff with him, a Mr. Cord from the land office, and he had found something in Thomas's paperwork, a disputed boundary survey from the original land claim that he was arguing gave him some right to contest the eastern border of the Wallace property. The claim was thin, and Lillian knew it was thin, but thin claims from men with money and connections were not always defeated by their thinness. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with Thomas's original land documents spread out in front of her, going over every line, her lamp burning hot and close. Edwin came in after she had been at it for 2 hours, knocked on the doorframe, and asked if he could look. She moved aside and he sat down across from her, and they went through the papers together, and Edwin said, "The survey line is clearly marked on the original claim, and the witness signatures are from 2 people Briggs would have trouble discrediting. The argument he has is about a postmarker that he claims was moved, but if you have any record of where that marker was placed originally, and when—" "Thomas mentioned it in a letter once," Lillian said. She went to the wooden box on the shelf, the one she had not opened since Thomas died, and found the letters she had written to Thomas before they married and the ones he had written back. She found the one from 8 years ago when he had first claimed the land, describing the boundary markers with a specificity that was almost absurd, and that she had thought at the time was very like Thomas, to catalog the practical world with such thoroughness. She held it out to Edwin. He read it. "That's your case right there," he said. "Get that to a lawyer in Flagstaff before Briggs gets further with the land office." "I don't know a lawyer in Flagstaff," she said. "I do," he said. "Aldous Crane used him twice. He's fair and he's thorough. I'll write to him tonight if you want." She looked at him for a moment. "Why do you know so much about this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "My father lost his farm to a disputed claim when I was 14, he said. "A man with money and a thin case and better connections than my father had. We moved west because of it." He paused. "I've been paying attention ever since." She held the letter in her hands and something moved through her, a slow, warm current of understanding, of why he was who he was, of how people are built by the things that have happened to them, and how sometimes those things, the hard ones, are exactly what makes a person the kind of person who shows up and stays. "Write the letter," she said. He did. She sent it to Flagstaff the next morning. The lawyer, a man named Hayes, replied within 10 days and agreed to take her case. The boundary dispute was resolved 2 months later, entirely in Lillian's favor. Harlan Briggs retreated to his Northland and did not come back to her porch again, and Lillian stood in her yard when she heard the news and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has held her own. Edwin was splitting wood near the barn when she came to tell him. She walked up and said, "We won," and the smile he turned on her was so bright and so completely unguarded that she stood looking at it for a moment longer than she meant to. September came and the land turned gold and copper, the cottonwoods going yellow along the creek, and the heat finally breaking into something manageable. Clara had started going to the school in town, riding in with Cobb on the mornings he made supply runs, and she had begun to talk with increasing enthusiasm about a girl named Ada who had a father who kept horses and a mother who made the best pie in the territory, and she had also begun to ask Lillian questions that were harder to answer. "Does Edwin like you?" Clara asked one evening, apropos of nothing, sitting at the table with her reader open in front of her. Lillian paused in her washing. "Why do you ask that?" "He looks at you," Clara said, with the frank certainty of a child who sees what adults try to obscure. "He looks at you like how Ada's papa looks at Ada's mama." Lillian turned back to her washing. "Edwin is a good man who works for us," she said. "That's not the same as not liking you," Clara said, with impeccable logic. "No," Lillian agreed after a moment. "It is not." Clara went back to her reader, apparently satisfied, and Lillian stared at the water in the basin and thought, very quietly and very privately, that her 5-year-old daughter was a great deal wiser than the situation perhaps required. The evening was warm enough to sit outside, and Lillian found Edwin on the porch steps after supper, which had become a habit for both of them without either of them having stated it as one. Clara was inside, already asleep, and Cobb was in town, and the night was very quiet except for the creek and the last insects of summer. "Thomas has been gone almost exactly a year," Lillian said. Edwin looked out at the dark. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said, about it just waiting, about the capacity not being used up." He was very still. "I have not been fair to myself," she said, "in thinking that to be ready I needed to have no fear left. I have been waiting to feel ready the way I feel ready to do a practical thing, like mending a fence or making the cattle drive. As though readiness is the absence of uncertainty. But I don't think that's what it is." He turned to look at her then. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am ready, not because all the fear is gone, but because I know what I feel, and I know who you are, and I know that life is short and the country is large, and I have spent a great deal of time being careful and responsible and appropriate, and I would like once to act on something I want before I have fully reasoned it into dust." He said her name, just that, just Lillian, in that low, even voice, and the whole of the night seemed to lean in. "I want to know if there is something here," she said, "between us, if you still want to find out." He was quiet for a moment, and it was not the silence of hesitation but the silence of a man who wants to say the next thing correctly. "There is already something here," he said. "There has been something here since about the 3rd week of December when you handed me back that reference letter and didn't soften your conditions even slightly, and I thought, there is a woman who knows exactly who she is." He paused. "I have been hoping you would trust it. I meant what I said. I would have waited as long as it took, but I am glad you don't want to wait any more." Lillian looked at him in the dark. "I am going to need this to be slow," she said, "for Clara's sake and for my own. I am not a girl who can race headlong into a thing." "I know," he said. "I have been paying attention." She reached over in the dark and placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch step. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it, carefully and completely, and they sat like that for a long while in the warm September night with the creek running quietly over its stones and the stars coming out one by one over the Arizona sky. They were slow. She had asked for slow, and he gave it to her genuinely, not as a performance of restraint but as a real and unhurried unfolding. They talked more. They rode together on the Sunday afternoons when the work was light enough to allow it, Lillian on her chestnut and Edwin on his gray, out through the mesquite and the juniper. And these rides became something she looked forward to with a clarity she found both alarming and wonderful. He had opinions about things, which she liked. He thought the treatment of the Apache people in the territory was an injustice that the government had been too slow and too dishonest in acknowledging. He said it plainly one afternoon when they rode past the remnants of a camp that had been forcibly cleared years ago, the stones of a fire ring still visible in the grass, and Lillian agreed with him because it was simply true, however little that truth was spoken aloud in Cutter's Creek. The land had belonged to other people first, and what had been done to those people in the name of settlement was something that sat uneasily in her conscience when she let herself think about it, which she did now more often because Edwin's willingness to say true things out loud gave her permission to think them more freely. He kissed her for the first time on an October afternoon when they were coming back from a ride and her horse stumbled on a loose stone and she slid half out of the saddle, and he caught her, his hands at her waist, steadying her back, and for a moment she was very close to him and very aware of him, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and the question was so clear in his eyes and the answer was so clear in her chest, and she leaned forward slightly, just slightly, and he met her there. And it was quiet and careful and warm, and it tasted like the end of waiting. She straightened and put her horse right, and they rode the rest of the way home in a charged and beautiful silence, and when they reached the yard, Edwin swung down from his horse and looked up at her with an expression she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately, open and warm and a little undone. "Lillian," he said. "I know," she said. "Me too." Clara noticed that things were different in the way children notice things, not through stated facts but through shifts in atmosphere. She began to include Edwin in her drawings, the ones she did with her charcoal stubs on the backs of used paper. Mama, Clara, the cows, and now Edwin, stick figures in a row with a house behind them. Lillian found one of these drawings on the table one morning and sat with it for a long time, turning it over in her hands, feeling the simple and certain thing it said. October turned to November and Cobb Whitley announced, with a sheepishness so profound it was almost comic, that Violet Hargrove had said yes, that they planned to marry in the spring, and that he would be moving to town. He looked terrified to say this, as though he expected Lillian to be angry. She hugged him, which startled him thoroughly, and told him that she was happy for him and that Violet was a good woman and that he had been a fine hand and she would give him a proper reference for whatever work he found in town. He left looking dazed, and after he went back to the bunkhouse she looked at Edwin and said, "We are going to need to find another hand in the spring." "We will," Edwin said, and neither of them remarked on the "we," though both of them heard it. In December, 1 year after Edwin Brenner had ridden through her gate on his gray horse and waited to be invited in, Lillian Wallace sat across from him at the kitchen table with Clara in bed and the lamp between them and said, "I have been thinking about what comes next." Edwin waited. "I have been thinking about whether it is time to stop thinking of you as a man who works for me," she said, "and to start thinking of you as something else." "What kind of something else?" he said. She looked at the lamp flame. "I am not a woman who needs to be taken care of," she said. "I want you to understand that. I have run this ranch for a year on my own with very little help, and I intend to keep running it, and any man who came into my life as a partner would need to understand that this land is mine and Clara is mine, and I will not trade one kind of dependence for another." "I know that," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Because a lot of men say they know it and then discover they did not quite mean it the way they thought." "Lillian," he said, "I came here because I needed work, and I stayed because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 30 years of living, and everything I have done on this ranch I have done because I believed in what you were building, not because I wanted to take it from you. I don't want your land. I want to be part of what you make of it. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long time. "I know there is," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud." "Say whatever you need to say," he said. "I am not going anywhere." "You said that before," she said. "I meant it then too," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. "I think," she said slowly, "that I love you. I think I have for a while. I wanted to be sure it was real before I said it, and I'm sure." The lamp between them burned steadily, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes that saw too much, and she did not mind any more that they saw too much, because everything they saw was already hers to be seen. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since before I had the right to, and I am glad we are both on the same side of it now." She laughed, and the laugh was bright and warm and real. "You are a remarkably patient man. You are a remarkably worth it woman," he said. They sat together at the table until the lamp burned low, talking about nothing urgent, talking about everything they had not said yet. And at some point, she moved around the table to sit beside him rather than across from him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat like that, just sitting. In the house that was hers, and the life she had built, and the warmth that had grown between them through a whole year of hard work and honest conversation, and the particular courage it took to say, "I am not ready," and the different but equal courage it took to say, "I will be here." He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in January, outside, near the cottonwood at the corner of the yard, in the cold morning air with the sky very blue and the creek iced over at the edges. He did not make a production of it. He asked her simply and seriously, the way he did everything, as though the question were the most natural one he had ever asked and also the most important. "Yes," she said. She said it without qualification. "Yes." He smiled, and it transformed his face the way it always did, that full, unguarded smile that she had been collecting like small, bright stones since August. Clara, who had been eavesdropping from behind the cottonwood with approximately 0% subtlety, said, "Are you going to kiss now?" And they both startled and then laughed, and Edwin said, "Come here, you." And she came running, and he swung her up, and she shrieked with delight. And Lillian stood watching the two of them in the January morning with a happiness so large and so clean it felt like the first deep breath after a long time of breathing shallow. They married in March 1883 in the small church in Cutter's Creek, with Me Dunlap in the front pew crying with a thoroughness that she would later attribute to dust in the eye, and that fooled nobody. Clara was the flower girl, and took the role with an extreme seriousness, dropping dried wildflowers with great deliberation along the aisle. Cobb Whitley was there with his new wife Violet, married just 2 weeks before, and they sat together with the particular glow of the newly-wed Lillian wore, a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Flagstaff, a warm ivory cotton with small buttons at the wrist, and she had put flowers in her hair the way her mother had done at her first wedding, except this time it did not feel like a practical transaction. This time it felt like a choice made in full knowledge and full freedom, and she stood at the altar beside Edwin Brenner and said the words and meant every one. Edwin wore a new coat and a clean shirt and his best hat, and he had gotten a haircut, and he stood beside her with an expression of such focused, quiet happiness that Me Dunlap cried harder and Lillian wanted to laugh and instead took his hand and felt it close around hers and thought, "Here. This is where things went right." The reception was held at the Hollowell Inn, with music from old Pete Garrity, who turned out to play the fiddle with surprising skill, and there was dancing, and Edwin danced with Lillian, and then with Clara, who demanded her turn with an imperious little hand extended, and he obliged with the same gravity he had brought to accepting her biscuit on the 3rd day of his employment, and Lillian watched from the side and thought about how a person who is good in consistent ways. The small ways and the large ways, and there is no substitute for that. She danced with him again later when the evening had worn into the warm, comfortable hours, and he held her properly, and they moved together with the ease of people who have been paying close attention to each other for more than a year. "Happy?" he asked her, his voice low near her ear. "Yes," she said simply. "Are you?" "More than I have words for," he said. They went home to the ranch that night, the 3 of them, under a sky full of stars, and the ranch was the same ranch it had always been, the same 40 acres and the same sound of cattle and the same creek running over its stones, but everything about it felt different in the way that things feel different when the person standing beside you is exactly the right person. Spring came and the calves came, and the work continued as it always had, with the difference that now, when Lillian and Edwin moved through the work of the ranch, there was something settled and whole about it. Not the careful negotiation of two people finding their footing, but the easy movement of two people who know where they stand. Cobb Whitley had been replaced by a man named Ruiz, who was quiet and skilled, and who treated everyone on the property with a calm respect that Lillian appreciated and Edwin matched. Clara thrived. She started the school year in September of 1883, reading ahead of her class and making her teacher, a thin, serious young woman from Ohio, slightly breathless with questions. She had taken to calling Edwin Papa Edwin, a compromise she had arrived at herself, and he had received this name with the same careful gravity with which he received all important things, and he had told Clara privately, which Clara had then immediately told Lillian, that he considered it the best name he had ever been given. Lillian found she was expecting their first child in the late autumn of 1883, and she told Edwin on a cold evening with the first fire of the season burning in the hearth, and his face did the thing it did when something moved him, went very still and then broke open entirely into that full, unguarded expression. He stood up and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that she had no adequate words for, and then he said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" Which was the right thing to say, the Edwin thing to say, concerned first with her and the practical present before anything else, and she laughed and said, "I feel wonderful and terrified, which seems appropriate." The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a good one, or rather, a hard one in all the expected ways, but a full one, a rich one. The ranch continued to hold its own. Lillian continued to manage the books and make the decisions, and Edwin continued to be the partner she had insisted she needed and had not been sure she would find. Someone who worked beside her and not over her, who contributed without taking over, who understood that her strength was not a problem to be managed, but a fact to be respected. Clara, having turned 6 and then 7 in the intervening time with the speed that children acquire, had grown into a small person of strong opinions and enormous warmth, and she had accepted the changes in their household with a resilience that sometimes made Lillian want to weep with gratitude. Children do not need the past to be perfect, Lillian had come to understand. They need the present to be safe, and in this present Clara was safe and loved and certain of both. Their son was born in July of 1884, on a hot afternoon with the sky piled high, with thunderclouds that broke over the mountains just as he announced himself to the world with a voice that seemed too large for his initial size. They named him James, which had been Edwin's father's name and which Lillian liked for its plainness and its solidness, the way it stood on its own without needing anything to lean on. Clara met her brother with a solemnity that lasted approximately 4 minutes before being replaced by a fierce and proprietary love that expressed itself primarily in telling everyone in the county about him. Me Dunlap came to see him and cried again, which she attributed to the heat. Edwin held his son in the evening light coming through the bedroom window and looked at him with an expression so complete and so tender that Lillian, lying in the bed watching them, felt her chest so full it almost hurt. "Hello, James," Edwin said. "I am going to do right by you." And Lillian, listening, believed him completely. The years that followed were years of building. The ranch grew, slowly and honestly. They acquired more cattle and eventually a small additional parcel to the south, when the man who held it decided to move to California and offered it to them at a fair price. Edwin proved himself again and again to be the man she had decided he was, not just in the large moments, but in the daily accumulation of small ones. The way he was with the children on hard days, the way he worked with Ruiz and the other hands they brought on over the years, the way he argued with her when he disagreed and listened when she argued back, and never once made her feel that her perspective was less because it came from a woman. Clara grew into herself with a speed that startled them both. By the time she was 10, she was keeping the smaller portion of the ranch books as a learning exercise, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight exactly as Lillian had done in those first hard months, brow furrowed in concentration. By 12, she could negotiate with a feed supplier with a calm that made the men on the other side of the counter blink in confusion, and then capitulate, which Lillian found privately hilarious and publicly very useful. James was a different kind of child, quieter than his sister, more inclined to sit and observe before he spoke, with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, and he had a way with the horses that Edwin said he had never seen in anyone so young. Edwin taught him everything he knew about horses, everything Aldous Crane's ranch in New Mexico had taught him, and everything his own years of observation had added. And watching them together in the corral on the long summer evenings, Lillian felt the particular contentment of a woman who has built something real from the materials life handed her. They had 2 more children, a daughter, Rose, born in 1887, who had Lillian's red-brown hair and Edwin's even temperament, and a laugh that seemed to begin somewhere very deep and come out like sunlight, and another son, Henry, born in 1889, who arrived into a family already well practiced in love, and took his place in it with an ease that suggested he had always known where he was going. The land held. This was not guaranteed, not in Arizona in the 1880s, where the weather was capricious and the cattle market was volatile, and the business of holding land required constant vigilance and occasional luck. There were 2 bad years. One drought year in 1886 that cut the herd by a third, and required them to draw down their reserves with a carefulness that kept Lillian at the ledger until very late into the night, and one disease year in 1888 that took several of the cattle before they identified it and contained it. But the Wallace ranch held, and it held because Lillian Wallace understood her land and her numbers and her business, and because Edwin Brenner understood that the best thing he could do was to stand beside her and work. They talked always. This was the thing she had not expected to be the central fact of their marriage, not the love, which she had expected would be large and dramatic in its early days and then soften into something quieter, but the conversation which never softened, which continued to be the thing they did at the end of every day, sitting on the porch in the summer evenings and at the kitchen table in the winter nights, talking about everything. The land and the children and the territory and the injustices they saw around them, the fate of the Apache people who had been stripped of land and dignity in the name of a progress that looked a great deal like greed from where they were standing, the changes coming to the territory, the talk of statehood, the railroad that was changing everything about how the West worked. They talked about their pasts, eventually, fully. She told him things she had not told Thomas, things from her Virginia childhood, the particular loneliness of being a girl who read too much in a community that found that suspicious, the way she had felt most herself when she was by herself with a book, and how that had made her wonder for years whether she was too solitary for genuine partnership. He told her things he had kept close about his father's lost farm and what it had done to his family, the way his father had shrunk after that, the way the West had seemed like the only direction where there was enough space to rebuild. "We are both rebuilding," she said once, on a winter evening with the fire bright and Clara at the table doing her schoolwork and James already asleep. "We built something new," he said. "I don't think of it as rebuilding." She looked at him. "You're right," she said. "It is new." He took her hand the way he had taken it on that September porch, all those years ago, with the same care and the same completeness. She leaned against his shoulder, there in the firelight, and they sat together in the house that was theirs now, fully and legally and in every other way that mattered, and the land outside was dark and full of stars, and the children were safe, and the creek ran over its stones in its patient way, and Lillian Wallace, who had once stood at a freshly turned grave in the blazing September sun, and felt the full weight of aloneness, understood that the weight she carried now was a different kind entirely. It was the weight of a life that had filled itself up to the edges with the things that mattered. Clara was 16 when Edwin and Lillian sat with her at the kitchen table one spring evening and told her, formally, because Clara was the kind of person who deserved to be told formally, about Edwin's legal intention to ensure she was fully recognized as his daughter in all matters of the estate, which the territorial law allowed, and which he had discussed with lawyer Hayes in Flagstaff, the same man who had defended their land boundary years before. Clara had listened with her characteristic stillness and then said, "Papa Edwin," which was still what she called him, which she had never stopped calling him, "I already knew you were my father. I just needed the papers to catch up." Edwin had looked at Lillian over Clara's head, and Lillian had looked back at him, and between them passed the particular understanding of two people who have traveled a considerable distance together, and arrived somewhere neither of them could have predicted, and both of them recognized as home. The ranch passed a full decade of operation under Lillian's ownership, and she marked it quietly one October evening by walking the perimeter of the property, the full boundary, the eastern line that Harlan Briggs had tried to take from her and failed, the Western Creek line, the southern parcels they had added. Edwin walked with her as he walked with her everywhere as he had walked with her since December of 1882, and when she stopped at the point where the eastern boundary marker stood, the one Thomas had described so carefully in a letter she still had, she put her hand on the post and was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "When you rode through that gate I was so tired," she said, "not just from the work. From trying to hold everything together and not let anyone see how hard it was. And you came in and you just worked, and you were just honest, and it sounds like a simple thing when I say it out loud, but it was not a simple thing to find." He listened as he had always listened. "I told you I wasn't ready," she said, "and you said you would be here when I was, and then you were. And I have thought about that so many times, how much it changed everything, just that, the space to not be ready, the certainty that the space would hold." He was quiet for a moment. "You gave me something too," he said. "You gave me a place where what I had to offer was enough. That is not a small thing either." She turned to look at him in the autumn light, this man with his gray-streaked hair, because time had put gray in his hair and lines at the corners of his eyes, and she was not unmarked by time herself, and she found she did not mind any of it at all. He was still Edwin, exactly and completely Edwin, and she was still Lillian, exactly and completely Lillian, and the two of them together were something she had no single word for except perhaps the truest one. She kissed him there at the boundary post, with the Arizona autumn all around them and the ranch spread out in every direction, and he held her the way he always held her, with that particular quality of attention, as though she were both solid and precious, as though she were exactly where she ought to be. "Come on," she said, when they broke apart, her hand still in his. "Clara will have supper on the table and James will have burned something." He laughed, and she felt it before she heard it, that low, warm laugh that had become one of the great comforts of her daily life. They walked back to the house together through the golden light. James had not burned anything. He was 14 now and entirely capable in the kitchen, a fact he accepted as simple and practical, and his sister Clara had accepted as slightly aggravating, given that she had worked very hard to learn to cook, and he had absorbed it apparently without effort. Rose was 7 and had taken it upon herself to set the table with unnecessary formality, as she was going through a period of finding formality satisfying. Henry, who was 5, was sitting under the kitchen table for reasons he had not explained and showed no signs of explaining. "Henry," Lillian said. "Hello, Mama," said Henry from under the table. "What are you doing under the table?" "Thinking," he said. "Is it good thinking?" "I'll tell you when I'm finished," he said. Edwin looked at Lillian and she looked at Edwin and they both looked at Henry, a small person with red-brown hair and Edwin's gray-green eyes and a philosophical interior life that expressed itself in unexpected ways. "All right," Lillian said. Come out when you're ready." They sat down to supper, the six of them, in the kitchen of the house that Lillian had first come to as a young wife from Virginia, the house she had nearly lost, the house she had held onto and built around and filled with the sound of children and work and daily life. The lamp above the table burned warm and yellow, and outside the creek ran over its stones, and the cattle were settled for the evening, and the boundary posts stood where they had always stood. Henry came out from under the table partway through the meal and said he had finished thinking and could he have the corn bread, and Rose said she had saved him a piece because she had suspected he would want it, and James said, without looking up from his plate, "Good thinking," and Clara said, "Someone has to," and Edwin looked at Lillian over the heads of their children with an expression that contained the full length of 10 years and the full depth of everything they had been to each other. Every conversation and every morning and every hard winter and every golden ride through the juniper country, and Lillian looked back at him with her whole face open, nothing held back, everything. She was available to him because she had learned, slowly and with great care, that some people earn that some people can be trusted with the whole of you. "Thank you," she said to him, quietly enough that only he could hear it. "For what?" he said. "For waiting," she said. He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly and completely. "Thank you," he said, "for being worth it." The children carried on around them with the noise and energy of children at supper, and the lamp burned steadily, and the land outside was theirs, and the night was coming on gentle and full of stars, and Lillian Wallace, who had once been alone in the middle of the largest sky she had ever seen, sat at her kitchen table surrounded by every good thing she had built and every good thing that had found her, and felt, completely and without reservation, at home. Henry decided his thinking spot was actually the porch, not under the table, and spent the next several weeks sitting there at odd hours of the day staring at the mountains with an expression of concentrated inwardness that reminded Edwin so strongly of Lillian in those early December evenings that he mentioned it to her once, and she had looked at her smallest son thoughtfully and said, "God help us all then." And they had both laughed until the horses looked up from the water trough to see what the commotion was. The years moved the way good years move, quickly when you are inside them, and only apparent in their fullness when you step back to see what has been accumulated. The Wallace Ranch became one of the more respected operations in that part of the territory, known for the quality of its cattle and the fairness of its dealings, and for the fact that Mrs. Brenner, as she was known in some circles, could outnegotiate any buyer in Flagstaff before they had finished their coffee. Edwin Brenner was known as a man of his word, good with horses and better with people, and that was enough. Clara went east to a school for 2 years, a thing Lillian had saved for deliberately since Clara was 10, and came back with new ideas and the same essential Clariness, which was a relief and a delight. She returned with a serious interest in law, and Lillian, who had spent a decade watching the law work and fail and work again in the Arizona territory, thought this was exactly right. James took over the horse operation at 16 with a skill that drew buyers from 3 counties. Rose, who had the even temperament of her father and the precision of her mother, showed every sign of becoming the kind of person who would run whatever she decided to run with a quiet thoroughness that would be very difficult to argue with. And Henry, who had done a great deal of thinking on the porch, turned out to have a gift for the land itself, for understanding it, for knowing what it needed and what it could give. And he took his father out one morning when he was 15 to show him a spring he had found on the southeast portion of the property that they had not known about. And Edwin had stood there looking at the clear water coming up through the red rock, and then looked at his youngest son and said, "Good thinking, Henry." And Henry had smiled in a way that was his father's smile entirely. It was a Tuesday morning in the early spring of 1895, the light coming in clean and pale through the kitchen windows, the smell of coffee and the sound of the creek, when Lillian sat down with her ledger and the morning's correspondence and found, among the letters, one from Lawyer Hayes in Flagstaff. She read it and set it down and looked out the window for a moment. Edwin came in from the barn with mud on his boots and a question already forming on his face, because he could read her silences the way a riverboat captain reads the water. "What is it?" he said. "Hayes is retiring," she said. "He says he wanted to inform us personally because of our long association. He says the practice is being taken over by a young attorney from Tucson." She paused. "He says he hopes the boundary matter is entirely in the past and that we have had no further trouble from that direction." Edwin took off his hat and set it on the peg and looked at her. "We haven't," he said. "No," she said. "We haven't." She looked at the letter again. It's strange how something that felt so large at the time becomes, eventually, just a sentence in a letter from a man who helped us win it. "Time does that," he said. "It does," she said. She folded the letter and set it with the others. "I want to write him a proper reply," she said. "Thank him properly." "You write it," Edwin said. "You always write it better than I do." "You write perfectly well," she said. "I write adequately," he said. "You write beautifully. There's a difference." She looked at him with the small, fond exasperation that had become one of her most frequently deployed expressions, the one that meant she was fully aware he was right and slightly annoyed about it. He sat down across from her at the table, the same table where they had gone over the cattle drive plans in that cold January of 1882, the same table where she had told him she was not ready and he had told her he would wait, and he poured himself a cup of coffee and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had, over 13 years, not changed in the particular quality of their attention. He still looked at her like that, like she was the most interesting thing in his landscape. She had grown used to it and still felt it every time. She opened the ledger and the morning moved around them. The sounds of the ranch waking up, Ruiz somewhere in the yard, James at the corral, the distant voices of Rose and Henry over something that would turn out to be a question about which of them got to carry the water bucket to the kitchen garden. A dispute that would resolve itself, as their disputes generally did, in an agreement so equitable that neither of them could remember what they had been arguing about. Lillian wrote the letter to Hayes, long and proper, as she did everything she believed in doing fully. She thanked him for his service and his honesty and his skill, and she told him that the property was in good health and that the family was well, and she sealed the letter with a clean hand and set it with the outgoing correspondence. She looked across the table at Edwin, who had finished his coffee and was reading the other letters, sorting them with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything. "Edwin," she said. He looked up. "I love you," she said. Not because there was a particular occasion for it, not as the culmination of a difficult conversation or the capstone of an important moment. Just because it was true and it was Tuesday morning and the light was coming in clean and pale, and she was sitting across the table from the person who had ridden through her gate on a gray horse in the cold December of 1882 and waited. He looked at her with his whole face open. "I love you," he said back. And outside, the creek ran over its stones, and the Arizona sky was enormous and blue and entirely itself. And the Wallace Ranch, which was the Brenner Ranch too now, and had been for more than a decade, sat solid and real in the morning light, every fence mended, every stone placed, every boundary held, built from the ground up by the particular combination of two people who had told each other the truth and kept their word. All of it exactly where it ought to be.